Let's begin our story with some of the worst fathers in medieval history. These men didn't just fail at parenting, they turned it into a disaster. First up is King John of England. You might know him as the villain in the Robin Hood stories, but he was also a terrible father. He became king in 1199, and in no time, he made everyone hate him. He fought with nobles, the Pope, his own family, and even his kids. John was selfish, careless, and sometimes violent. One sad story is about his nephew Arthur of Brittany. Arthur had a claim to the throne, so John saw him as a threat. John captured him, and it's believed, starved him to death in a castle. That's not how family problems should be solved. He also imprisoned his wife for 10 years, leaving their son, Henry III, with a broken kingdom and a mess of problems. John lost land in France, raised taxes, and was so bad that the nobles made him sign the Magna Carta to limit his power, then he ignored it. To his kids, he was not a wise father, but more like a grumpy landlord with a crown. Now, let's move to Ivan the Terrible of Russia. He started as a smart and ambitious ruler, but later, he became paranoid and cruel. He created secret police and executed thousands of people. His worst moment as a father came when he got angry at his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing clothes he didn't like. His son Ivan stood up to him, and in a rage, Ivan the Terrible hit his son on the head with a metal stick. His son died. There's even a painting of Ivan holding his dead son, realizing too late what he had done. This act ruined his family and left Russia with weak rulers, starting a period of chaos known as the Time of Troubles. Then we have Peter of Castile, also called Peter the Cruel. He ruled Spain in the 14th century. Peter had many children with different women, but treated them badly. He didn't raise them with love or prepare them for leadership. He focused more on fighting with his half-brother Henry, instead of ignoring him like most brothers might. Peter started a war and even stabbed another brother during a supposed peace meeting. After his death, none of his kids became King. Henry took the throne instead. Peter made fatherhood a bloody and dangerous business. Next is Emperor Basil I of the Byzantine Empire. He came from a poor background, but climbed to the top through strength and charm. He became co-emperor with Michael III, who was also possibly his friend or more, but Basil ended up killing Michael to take full control. His real failure, though, was with his son, Leo. Basil didn't believe Leo was really his child, so he treated him with suspicion and anger. When Leo showed interest in books or leadership, Basil would respond by banning books or punishing Leo's friends. He even tortured Leo's advisor. When Basil died in a strange hunting accident, Leo didn't seem too sad. Then there was Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. He wasn't fair in how he acted, just in appearance. He was cold and strict, like a boss in an office where no one smiles. He had 3 sons and a daughter, but showed little affection. The biggest scandal of his reign was when his daughter Isabella visited home and noticed her brother's wives might be having affairs. Philip launched a full investigation, arrested the women, tortured the lovers, and had them executed. The women were imprisoned, and the sons were embarrassed publicly. Philip never tried to fix the family after this. His sons became kings, but none ruled well. A cold father raised cold-hearted kings. Now, let's talk about Charles VI of France. People first called him Charles the Beloved because he was handsome and liked, but later he was known as Charles the Mad. His mind slowly started to fail. He forgot things, had angry outbursts, and once attacked his own knights in a forest, thinking they were enemies. He believed he was made of glass and forgot who his children were. He had 12 kids, but during his mental breakdowns, he didn't recognize them or help them. His wife tried to keep the kingdom stable, but Charles was too lost in his illness. His son had to grow up during war and betrayal, with no support from his father. Sometimes the worst kind of father isn't cruel, it's the one who isn't there at all. Edward I of England, also known as Longshanks, was another strict and terrifying father. He was tall, tough, and famous for building castles and fighting wars. But his biggest challenge was raising his son, Edward II. The son was soft, liked music and poetry, and didn't care much for war, everything his father hated. Edward I tried to change him by using fear. He even threatened to remove him as heir. When Edward I died, his son became king, but failed badly. He brought back his close friend that his father hated, mismanaged the kingdom, and was overthrown by his wife and her lover. Edward I ruled with strength, but couldn't guide his son at all. Finally, look at John of Bohemia. He was brave, a knight, and loved adventure more than family. He had a son named Charles IV, who became a great ruler. But growing up, Charles didn't see much of his father. John was always away fighting wars or going on crusades. He left his son with strangers to raise him. John's last act showed just how reckless he was. He charged into battle completely blind, tied between two knights so he could die fighting. And he did. Charles was left to clean up the mess and rule a kingdom without any help or training from his father. John loved glory more than parenting. Let's continue with more famous men who ruled nations, but failed as fathers. William the Conqueror is best known for invading England in 1066 and becoming its king. He changed English history forever, but at home, his family life was a mess. William was born out of wedlock and grew up fighting for power. He ruled through fear, not love. He had many children, including 4 sons, and expected them to be tough like him. His oldest son, Robert Curthos, which means short pants, not a great nickname, was meant to inherit Normandy, but William didn't trust him. Robert had a bad temper and once got into a public fight with his brothers. He demanded more power, and when William refused, Robert rebelled. William was so angry, he led an army to attack his own son's castle. In one battle, Robert even knocked William off his horse without realizing it was his father. William was furious mostly because it was embarrassing. He never fully forgave Robert. In the end, he split his kingdom between his sons Normandy to Robert, England to another son, William Rufus. That decision led to decades of family fighting, war, and even murder. William built a powerful kingdom, but failed to teach his sons how to rule together. Now meet Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. He lived up to his name: bold, brave, and very dramatic. He inherited huge lands and wealth from his father, Philip the Good, who was a capable ruler. Charles had only one child, a daughter named Mary of Burgundy. Because he had no sons, he put all his hopes on her, but instead of preparing her to lead, he focused on expanding his lands through war. Charles loved to fight. He battled France, the Swiss, and the Holy Roman Empire. He always thought he could win and didn't listen to warnings. In 1477, he went too far and charged into a battle with the Swiss. He was killed, and his body was found days later, frozen and eaten by wolves. That left 19-year-old Mary with the kingdom full of enemies and no support. She had to marry into the Habsburg family just to survive, which changed European history and caused wars for centuries. Charles didn't leave her a strong throne, he left her a mess. Next is Alfonso She of Castile. He was a successful military leader in Spain during the 14th century, but as a father, he created massive problems. He married Maria of Portugal for political reasons, but didn't love her. Instead, he spent his life with his mistress, Leonor de Guzman, and they had 10 children together, yes, 10, and he openly showed them off at court. He gave them titles, land, and attention, while ignoring his wife and their son, Peter. When Alfonso died suddenly of the Black Death, 15-year-old Peter became king. Angry about how his mother had been treated, one of Peter's first acts was to arrest and execute Leonor. This sparked a civil war between Peter and his many half-brothers. Alfonso's failure to keep his personal life separate from politics led to violence and chaos. He might have been strong in battle, but his family was left broken. Richard the Lionheart was a heroic figure, king of England, crusader, and military legend. But as a father, he left nothing behind. Literally, he had no legitimate children. He was married to Berengaria of Navarre, but barely spent time with her. Some say they were only together for a few days. Richard might have had one illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac, but he didn't give him land or titles. That son disappeared from history soon after Richard's death. Richard ruled for 10 years, but only spent about 6 months in England. He was always off fighting wars and living out his crusade dreams. He drained the country's money for his battles, and when he was captured, England had to pay a huge ransom. His brother, John, had to raise taxes to cover the cost, which made him deeply unpopular. Richard didn't just ignore fatherhood, he ignored the whole kingdom. He was great at leading armies, but terrible at leaving a legacy. Then there's Louis, she of France, also called the Spider King for his sneaky, controlling ways. He ruled in the 15th century and built a powerful, centralized government, but when it came to his only surviving son, Charles, he was a nightmare. Louis didn't want a strong heir. He wanted someone he could control, so he raised Charles in isolation, gave him just enough education to read official papers, and surrounded him with people who wouldn't get too close. Louis didn't let Charles make decisions. He even changed his son's staff regularly, so no one could influence him. Louis once thought about disinheriting Charles just for speaking out. Even when Louis was dying, he refused to hand over power. He tried to rule from his sickbed through letters and messengers. When Charles finally became king in 1483 at age 18, he had no experience and no idea how to govern. Louis ruled through fear and paranoia. He was a clever king, but as a father, he failed his son completely. Now, let's talk about Charles II of England, known as the Merry Monarch. He came to power in 1660 after years of war and wanted to bring back fun. He reopened theaters, held parties, and lived a life full of pleasure. But when it came to being a father, he was completely irresponsible. He never had any legitimate children with his wife, Queen Catherine, but he had at least 12 illegitimate children with mistresses, actresses, noblewomen, and even a woman who dressed as a milkmaid to catch his attention. Charles gave his children fancy titles like Duke or Earl, but didn't do much else. He left them to be raised by their mothers or nannies and showed little interest in their futures. One of his sons, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, even tried to claim the throne after Charles died, but he failed and was executed. Charles liked to joke that he was the father of his people and many more. That joke summed up his parenting style: charming, careless, and shallow. Finally, we reach Louis XIV of France, the famous Sun King. He ruled for 72 years, the longest of any European monarch. He was powerful, glamorous, and thought of himself as the center of the world. He had one legitimate son, the Grand Dauphin, and at least 16 illegitimate children. He even made many of those illegitimate kids into nobles. But Louis wasn't a loving father. He was everywhere, controlling everything. His son grew up in the beautiful but strict palace of Versailles, surrounded by rules and spies. Louis didn't trust anyone, not even his own son. He never gave the Dauphin any real power, and often ignored his ideas. His son died before him, as did his grandson and great-grandson. Louis outlived 3 generations of heirs. His constant control meant none of them ever learned how to rule. Even his illegitimate children were used more like chess pieces than family. Louis didn't abuse or neglect his children, he smothered them with control. When he died, he left a country full of people used to obeying, but not leading. Long before people had weather apps or TV forecasts, ancient civilizations were already studying the sky to understand and predict the weather. For them, knowing what the weather would do was not just interesting, it was a matter of survival. They depended on weather for farming, travel, and even making decisions about war. From Babylon to Egypt, the stars, clouds, animals, and mountains all became tools in the effort to read the skies. Let's begin with the Babylonians. These ancient people lived in what is now Iraq, near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their cities needed careful planning and good weather predictions to survive. Priests, known as sky watchers, would climb tall temple towers called ziggurats to get a clear view of the sky. They wrote their observations on clay tablets using cuneiform writing. Thousands of these tablets have been found. They included weather omen signs that something big might happen depending on the sky's behavior. For example, if a cloud formed in the west, it might mean a flood was coming. If thunder was heard from the north, it could be a sign of war. Red skies at night might mean angry gods or failed crops. They didn't guess randomly, they kept long-term records and looked for patterns. They noticed how moon phases, star movements, and lightning patterns often repeated alongside events on Earth. It wasn't exactly modern science, but it was surprisingly close. Now, let's move ancient Egypt, where the most important weather event was not rain or sunshine, it was the yearly flooding of the Nile River. This flood brought water and nutrients to the soil, making it possible to grow crops. But the flood had to arrive at the right time. Too early, and planting would be impossible. Too late, and crops wouldn't have enough time to grow. So the Egyptians learned to watch the stars to predict the flood. The most important star was Sirius, the brightest in the night sky. Every year, just before sunrise, Sirius would appear on the horizon. When it did, Egyptians knew the flood was coming within days. Priests called hour watchers used tall columns and water clocks to track the stars. They carefully measured the movement of Sirius and other stars. When Sirius rose, it marked the Egyptian New Year and a time of celebration. It also told farmers that it was time to prepare for planting. To measure the flood itself, they used tools called nilometers, stone pillars placed in the river. If the water rose to a high, they feared destruction. If it didn't rise enough, they expected famine. The balance had to be just right. The Egyptians also believed that the goddess Isis, connected to the star Sirius, wept tears into the Nile, causing the flood. So, religion, astronomy, and farming were all tied together. In the Andes Mountains of South America, people faced a different challenge. They didn't have a big river like the Nile or stars always visible. Instead, they developed their own ways to understand the weather, often turning to animals for clues. Farmers in the highlands watched llamas, alpacas, and even guinea pigs. If llamas started acting restless or changed their grazing patterns, it could mean a storm or cold weather was coming. Guinea pigs were believed to sense changes before humans could. But it wasn't just about animals. Andean people, especially the Quechua and Aymara, looked to the sky and the land too. One of their methods involved watching the Milky Way, specifically the dark patches in the sky known as yana fuyu, or black clouds. These were shapes made not of stars, but of dust. If the shape looked like a llama, they believed rainfall would be plentiful. If the shape was faint or broken, it meant drought. They also paid close attention to mountain snowlines. If the snow melted too fast, it meant a dry season. If snow stayed longer than usual, it could mean floods were coming. The Andean people believed in reciprocity with nature, the idea that you don't control the weather, but you can work with it. They gave offerings to the earth in ceremonies called pago alatira to keep balance with nature. Timing was critical. Plant crops too early or too late, and the whole harvest could fail. Now, let's visit ancient China, where the weather was seen as a reflection of the balance between heaven and earth. The emperor was known as the son of heaven, and if the weather was bad, people believed something was wrong with the emperor or the kingdom. A drought or a flood was not just a natural event, it was a warning that the cosmic balance was off. Chinese weather prediction was based on the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, and the yin and yang energies. These ideas shaped how they understood the world, including the weather. For example, too much fire and not enough water could explain a drought. But they didn't just use philosophy, they also observed carefully. Ancient records show that Chinese scholars wrote down cloud patterns, wind directions, temperature changes, and rainfall. They used tools like water clocks and early wind vanes. In fact, China was one of the first places to invent a rain gauge and a seismograph for earthquakes. They categorized clouds not by shape, but by their meaning. A cloud shaped like a dragon could mean rain. Red clouds at sunset might mean war or political trouble. If the weather went wild, floods, storms, or locusts, it was taken as a sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, a kind of divine permission to rule. People could use these signs to justify rebellion. So understanding the weather wasn't just science, it was politics. Let's head now to ancient Greece, where the weather started to be studied in a more logical way. The Greeks still believed in gods like Zeus, who threw thunderbolts, but some thinkers began to ask new questions. What if the weather wasn't caused by angry gods, but by natural forces? A philosopher named Anaximander suggested that the sun caused moisture to rise and form clouds, which then led to rain. That's not far from what we know today. Later, Aristotle wrote a book called Meteorologica, where he tried to explain everything from rain to lightning using reason and observation. He thought storms were caused by air, water, fire, and earth mixing in different ways. Some of his ideas were wrong, like thinking comets were burning air, but the attempt to explain weather scientifically was revolutionary. At the same time, regular Greek farmers followed more traditional methods. A poet named Hesiod wrote works and Days, a kind of farming guide. It told farmers when to plant and harvest based on signs like bird migrations or the rising of the constellation Orion. If cranes flew south, winter was coming. If Orion rose early, it was time to prune vines. Sailors, too, used wind patterns to plan their routes. Harbors, trade routes, and even temples were built to match the wind's direction. While some Greeks looked to science, others still believed in omens. A howling dog at night or a ring around the moon could be taken as signs of trouble. But overall, the Greeks took a big step, treating weather not just as divine anger, but as something humans could understand and predict. We now move to ancient India, where predicting the weather was all about understanding patterns in nature. Indian farmers depended heavily on the monsoon, a seasonal wind that brings rain. If the monsoon was late or too weak, crops would die. If it came too early or with too much rain, floods could destroy villages. Getting the timing right was everything. The oldest records of Indian weather knowledge come from the Vedas, religious texts written over 3,000 years ago. These weren't just prayers, they included farming advice and weather clues passed down over generations. The god Indra was especially important. He ruled the storms and brought the rains. When Indra was pleased, the monsoon came. When he was angry, drought followed. But Indian weather watchers didn't only rely on gods. They carefully observed nature. The year was divided into 6 Rita seasons, each with its own weather signs. Farmers knew that when certain flowers bloomed or birds migrated, the monsoon was near. If frogs croaked more at night, it could mean rain was coming. These clues helped them decide when to plant. Later, Indian scholars like Varahamihira in the 6th century wrote detailed guides for predicting the weather. His book, the Brihat Samhita, listed over 100 signs for rain. These included the color of the sky at sunrise and how snakes and ants behave. He combined star movements, moon phases, and animal activity into one system. This wasn't just guesswork, it was centuries of experience written down for others to learn. Now, explore North America, where Native American tribes also developed unique ways to forecast the weather. There were hundreds of different tribes, each living in different landscapes from forests to deserts to icy tundras. They all found ways to read nature for survival. In the Great Plains, tribes like the Lakota and Blackfoot watched the buffalo. If the herd suddenly moved or huddled together tightly, it meant a storm was coming. They also observed birds. If birds flew low and fast, rain was near. If they flew high and slow, it meant calm weather. In the dry Southwest, the Hopi people paid close attention to insects and stars. If ants built tall mounds, it meant rain was coming. The Hopi calendar followed the movement of stars. When the Pleiades, a group of stars, rose before sunrise, it was time to plant corn. Just like the Egyptians used Sirius, the Hopi used the stars to guide their farming. In the Pacific Northwest, tribes like the Tlingit and Haida watched the sea. They looked at the color of the water, the fog, and the behavior of fish and whales. If whales arrived early, it might mean a harsh winter. If salmon came late, it could mean a dry summer. For these tribes, everything in nature was connected. Some tribes also used rituals to predict or influence the weather. The Iroquois sang special songs to the spirit of thunder. Cherokee shamans looked at cloud shapes during ceremonies to decide the right time to plant crops. These rituals were not separate from weather prediction, they were part of it. Nature was not just observed, it was respected and treated like family. Now, it head far into the Pacific Ocean, to the islands where the Polynesians lived. These people are known as some of the greatest navigators in history. They traveled thousands of miles across open ocean in canoes, with no maps, no compasses, and no written instructions. How did they do it? By reading the ocean and the sky with amazing skill. Polynesian navigators, called wayfinders, were trained from childhood. They watched how waves moved under the boat, how clouds formed over islands, and how birds flew. If the waves suddenly changed rhythm, they knew a storm might be near. The smell of the air, the color of the sea, and even the shape of clouds gave them clues. Clouds were very important. During the day, if they saw a tall white cloud rising early in the morning, it meant clear skies. If that same cloud flattened and darkened in the evening, a storm was likely. Clouds also helped them find land. Some clouds always formed over certain islands, so sailors used them like signposts. Polynesians also studied the stars. They memorized star paths, the rising and setting points of dozens of stars. These paths told them which way they were going. But stars also gave seasonal signs. When the star Antares rose just before dawn, it meant the cyclone season was starting. These star signs helped them prepare for rough weather. All this knowledge was passed down through oral tradition. There were no books. Instead, they learned through chants, songs, and stories. The information was repeated again and again, till it became second nature. Even the color of the water told them things. If the ocean turned from deep blue to green, it might mean a coral reef or a warmer current with storms ahead. Today, we check a phone to see if it'll rain. But for most of history, people learned to feel the weather. They listened to the land, the sky, and the animals. And they trusted their senses and stories passed down through generations. Ancient people didn't just guess, they observed and remembered. They survived not by fighting nature, but by working with it. Let's end this section by remembering something important. Even though ancient weather prediction wasn't always scientific in the modern sense, it was smart. People around the world used the tools they had: their eyes, ears, and memory to understand something as unpredictable as the weather. They respected nature and saw it as a part, not a problem. We often think of science as something new, but the truth is, long before satellites and supercomputers, people were already building weather systems using the stars, the soil, and the behavior of animals. And their wisdom still inspires us today. By the year 44 BC, Julius Caesar was the most powerful man in Rome. He wasn't a king, at least not officially, but he acted like one. He rose from a nearly broke noble family to become a general, a war hero, and the ruler of the Roman Republic. His greatest military victory was the conquest of Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium. For nearly 10 years, he led Roman soldiers across Europe, becoming rich and very popular. His troops loved him so much, they would follow him anywhere. But Caesar's power made people in Rome nervous, especially the Senate. When they told him to give up command in 49 BC, he didn't listen. Instead, he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, which was against the law. This started a civil war. Caesar defeated his enemies, including Pompey, a top general, and returned to Rome as a victor. Once back in Rome, Caesar made big changes. He gave out citizenship to more people, cut debts, added more senators, mostly his supporters, and even changed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar, which we still use versions of today. He wore purple robes, sat on a golden chair, and had statues made in his image. Coins were printed with his face. Priests called him a living god. His ally, Mark Antony, even tried to crown him during a public festival. Caesar refused, but only after pausing for dramatic effect. To the common people, Caesar was a hero. To many senators, he looked like a dangerous tyrant. Rome had gotten rid of kings 500 years earlier. Now, Caesar looked like he was trying to bring monarchy back. Behind the scenes, a group of powerful men in the Senate were getting ready to stop him. Their leader was Cassius, a general who hated how Caesar had grabbed so much power. But the key person they wanted was Brutus. He came from a family famous for kicking out kings. Caesar had once forgiven Brutus for fighting against him, and even treated him like a son. That made Brutus feel torn. Was he loyal to Caesar, or to the Roman Republic? Cassius worked on Brutus carefully, feeding him flattery and guilt. Eventually, Brutus joined the plan. That gave the plot more weight. With him on board, it didn't look like treason, it looked like tradition. More than 60 senators joined the conspiracy. Some wanted to restore the Republic. Others just wanted Caesar gone for personal reasons. They picked a date, March 15th, known as the Ides of March. Caesar was planning to leave Rome for a military campaign soon. If they didn't act now, they might never get another chance. The Senate was meeting at the Theater of Pompey, and that would be the perfect place. Caesar wouldn't expect an attack from his fellow senators. They chose to use daggers, not swords. Their only hope was to act fast and surprise him. On the morning of March 15th, the city felt uneasy. There were rumors and bad omens. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had nightmares about his murder and begged him to stay home. At first, he agreed, but one of the conspirators, Decimus Brutus, came to his house and convinced him to attend the Senate. He warned Caesar that skipping the meeting would make him look weak. So Caesar left home and walked toward the Senate. Someone handed him a note warning him of the plot, but he never read it. When Caesar entered the chamber, the senators gathered around him, pretending to talk. One man pulled down Caesar's robe. That was the signal. The first blow came from Servilius Casca, and it was clumsy. Caesar shouted, "What are you doing, you villain?" Then the others joined in. They stabbed wildly Caesar, and even each other by accident. He was stabbed 23 times, though only one wound was deadly. According to legend, Caesar's last words were to Brutus, "Et tu, Brute," meaning, "You too, Brutus." Some say he said nothing at all, just pulled his robe over his face in silence. He died at the base of a statue of Pompey, his old enemy. The senators believed they had saved the Republic, but they were very wrong. After Caesar was murdered, the killers expected people to thank them. They thought Rome would celebrate the return of freedom, but instead, the city was thrown into panic. Some senators ran out in fear, others stayed frozen. The killers raised their bloody hands and shouted that Caesar was dead and Rome was free. But outside the Senate, the Roman people were furious. They loved Caesar. He had given them food, land, and hope. To them, this wasn't justice. It was murder. The conspirators fled to a safe place on the Capitoline Hill, afraid for their lives. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and co-leader, stepped up to calm the situation. He made a deal. The Senate wouldn't punish the killers, but Caesar's laws would stay in place. It was a fragile peace meant to stop a civil war, but it didn't last. Soon after, Caesar's will was read out loud. In it, he named his grandnephew Gaius Octavius, later called Augustus, as his adopted son and heir. He also left money and land to the people of Rome. That made him even more beloved, even in death. Caesar was giving to the people. Antony was already popular, but now Octavian arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance. He was only 18, with no army or real power, but he used Caesar's name and memory to win hearts. He promised to give out Caesar's gifts and fulfill his promises. Many of Caesar's old soldiers and veterans joined him. Now, there were two powerful men, Antony and Octavian, both trying to control Rome in Caesar's name. The peace would not hold. Caesar's death hadn't saved the Republic. It had set it on fire. Just days after the assassination, Caesar's body was put on display in the Roman Forum. His coffin was covered in gold and purple cloth. The people gathered in huge numbers to mourn. Mark Antony gave a powerful funeral speech. He read Caesar's will and told the crowd how Caesar had left them money and parks. The people were moved. Then Antony showed them Caesar's blood-soaked robe, holding it up and pointing to each stab wound. Some say he even lifted Caesar's body itself. The crowd went wild with anger. They tore benches from buildings and made a funeral fire in the middle of the forum. They burned Caesar's body right there. Then they marched through the streets, trying to burn the houses of the killers. Some of the conspirators barely escaped. The assassins thought they had killed a tyrant, Instead, they had made Caesar a martyr. Antony became more powerful than ever. Octavian, the quiet teenager, was also gaining support. The Ides of March had changed Rome forever. Caesar was gone, but his name and legacy were stronger than ever. And now, two men were about to fight over what he left behind. After Julius Caesar's dramatic funeral, Rome was a city full of tension. The people were angry, and powerful men were ready to fight for control. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, now seemed like the new leader, but he wasn't the only one. Caesar's will named his teenage grandnephew, Octavian, as his adopted son and heir. Most people didn't take Octavian seriously. He was only 18, small, sickly, and had no army. But they were wrong to underestimate him. Octavian had one big advantage: he had Caesar's name. He quickly started calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar, Octavianus, linking himself closely to the fallen leader. Then he did something very smart. When Antony hesitated to hand out Caesar's promised gifts, Octavian stepped in and paid the people from his own borrowed money. This won him the hearts of the public. He also began reaching out to Caesar's old soldiers. These men had fought hard in Gaul and the civil wars. They loved Caesar and were ready to follow his heir. Octavian promised them land, rewards, and justice. Slowly, his support grew. At the same time, Antony was making enemies in the Senate. He acted too powerful and didn't trust anyone. The Senate began to see Octavian as a useful tool to push Antony back. Octavian played his part well. He looked humble, but he was actually a brilliant strategist. While Antony gave fiery speeches, Octavian made quiet deals. The two men were headed for a showdown, but neither could win alone. Then came a strange twist. Lepidus, a lesser-known general who had served under Caesar, still controlled a large part of the Roman army. Octavian and Antony decided to join forces with him. The three men formed the Second Triumvirate, a formal and legal alliance that gave them huge powers. Unlike the earlier alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this one was officially approved by the Senate. Their first move? Revenge. They created a list of people to kill political enemies, wealthy nobles, and anyone who might oppose them. These were called proscription lists, and they led to a wave of brutal executions. Even Cicero, the famous speaker and philosopher who had supported Octavian, was killed. Octavian allowed it to happen for the sake of the alliance. Power was more important than friendship, but the real targets were still out there: Brutus and Cassius, the men who had killed Caesar. They had escaped to the eastern provinces and built strong armies. They were preparing to defend what was left of the Roman Republic. The stage was set for one final war. In 42 BC, the two sides met near Philippi in northern Greece. On one side stood Brutus and Cassius, leaders of the assassination and champions of the old republic. On the other side stood Octavian and Antony, fighting to avenge Caesar and take control of Rome. The armies were huge, nearly 200,000 soldiers in total. Brutus and Cassius had the advantage of higher ground and stronger positions, but Antony was a skilled and aggressive general. On October 3rd, the first battle began. Antony broke through Cassius's defenses, and Cassius believed that Brutus had also lost. He thought the battle was over, so he committed suicide with the same sword he had used to kill Caesar. But he was wrong. Brutus was still fighting. For a few more weeks, Brutus held his ground. Then on October 23rd, the second and final battle began. Without Cassius and heavily outnumbered, Brutus's army was crushed. Brutus fled, and like Cassius, he took his own life. His last words were about lost hope and wasted ideals. With Brutus and Cassius dead, the Republic died with them. Octavian and Antony were now the masters of Rome. But peace didn't come. The alliance between the two men started to break. Antony stayed in the east, where he grew close to Cleopatra, the powerful queen of Egypt. Their relationship made Romans suspicious. Rumors spread that Antony wanted to divide Rome and give parts of it to Cleopatra's children. Octavian, meanwhile, returned to Rome and acted like the protector of Roman values. He began a clever campaign to turn public opinion against Antony. He said Antony had been bewitched by Cleopatra and was betraying Rome. This plan worked. The Senate and the people began to see Octavian as the safer choice. The final break came in 31 BC, when the two sides met in the Battle of Actium, a huge naval fight. Octavian's general, Agrippa, outsmarted Antony's fleet. Cleopatra and Antony fled back to Egypt. A year later, surrounded by Octavian's forces, they both committed suicide. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra is said to have used a poisonous snake. Now, Octavian stood alone. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. He didn't call himself a king or dictator. Instead, in 27 BC, he offered to give up his powers. The Senate refused and instead gave him new titles. The most important one was Augustus, meaning the revered one. It sounded modest, but it meant he had total control. This was the beginning of the Roman Empire. Augustus ruled for over 40 years. He brought peace, rebuilt Rome, and reformed the government. He avoided the mistakes Caesar made by not acting like a tyrant, even though he held more power than any king before him. But behind this peaceful image was a hard truth. The Roman Republic was dead. The ideals of shared rule and free speech were gone. They had died with Brutus and Cassius on the battlefield. Caesar's blood had not saved liberty. It had cleared the way for monarchy. Now, we travel far from Rome and into medieval Japan, where another man rose from hardship to supreme power. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and his story is one of survival, patience, and planning. He didn't start as a ruler. In fact, as a child, he was used as a political hostage, a living promise between rival clans. Ieyasu was born in 1543 as Matsudaira Takachiyo, during a time when Japan was full of war and chaos. Different warlords called daimyo were fighting for control and loyalty, often shifted overnight. His family, the Matsudaira clan, wasn't powerful enough to stand alone. So when Takachiyo was just 6 years old, his family sent him away to form an alliance with the powerful Imagawa clan. But things didn't go as planned. On the way, another clan, the Oda, captured him. He spent 2 years as their prisoner, treated well, but still used as a pawn. Eventually, through deals and trades, he was handed over to the Imagawa, who raised him in their capital city. There, he received a good education. He learned Chinese philosophy, martial arts, and war strategy. But more importantly, he learned how to wait. While other boys rushed into battle, Ieyasu watched and planned. When he was a teenager, he took a new name, Matsudaira Motoyasu. He was allowed to lead small military groups and proved to be cautious and clever. He married into a noble family and kept his loyalty to the Imagawa for a while. Then, in 1560, everything changed. The Imagawa leader, Yoshimoto, led a big army westward, but he was ambushed and killed by Oda Nobunaga, a bold young warlord. Suddenly, the Imagawa were leaderless, and Motoyasu saw his chance. He took back his family's castle in Mikawa and declared independence. No longer a hostage, he was now a free daimyo. Motoyasu knew he needed allies to survive. So in 1561, he made a deal with the same man who had destroyed his old masters, Oda Nobunaga. The two agreed to support each other, and to prove his loyalty, Motoyasu even sent his son Hidehida to live with Nobunaga as a hostage, just as he had once been. Around this time, he changed his name again to Tokugawa Ieyasu, connecting himself to a respected family name to gain more power. For the next 20 years, Ieyasu stayed loyal to Nobunaga. While Nobunaga rushed through Japan with violence and ambition, Ieyasu moved slowly and carefully. He focused on strengthening his home region of Mikawa. He reformed land laws, made sure his soldiers were loyal, and avoided taking too many risks. When he did fight, he won with smart strategies. While Nobunaga burned down temples and crushed enemies, Ieyasu quietly built power. In 1582, Nobunaga was suddenly betrayed by one of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, and forced to kill himself. The news shocked Japan. The most powerful man in the country was gone. Many expected Ieyasu to take over, but he didn't. He waited. Another general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi moved quickly and took control of central Japan. Ieyasu did not challenge him right away. He knew the timing wasn't right. In 1584, they fought one brief war, but it ended in a draw. After that, Ieyasu accepted a peace deal and became Hideyoshi's vassal. It was only in name, though he kept his independence. He was biding his time. Hideyoshi ruled Japan for years, and during that time, Ieyasu kept growing stronger. He watched as Hideyoshi sent huge armies to invade Korea, hoping to conquer China too. The invasions failed, and many people were unhappy. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, he left behind a young son, too young to rule. A group of generals were chosen to act as protectors of the boy and the country. Ieyasu was one of those generals, but he had no plan to protect the boy. He wanted the country for himself. Tension grew between Ieyasu and the other leaders. In 1600, the two sides met at the Battle of Sekigahara, the biggest and most important battle in Japanese history. Ieyasu's army faced a large group of enemies, but he had secretly convinced some of them to betray their allies during the battle. The plan worked. His enemies were confused and surrounded. Ieyasu won. After the battle, he was the undisputed leader of Japan. In 1603, he was named shogun, the top military ruler. The emperor still existed, but only as a symbol. The real power now belonged to the Tokugawa family. Ieyasu didn't stop after becoming shogun. He made more reforms, took more land from his enemies, and created a system that would keep his family in power for over 250 years. He set up a government in Edo, now Tokyo, forced rival lords to live part-time in the capital, and made it nearly impossible for anyone to rebel. He stepped down as shogun in 1605 and gave the title to his son, but he still controlled everything from behind the scenes. He died in 1616, but his plan worked. His family, the Tokugawa shogunate, ruled peacefully until the 1800s. Ieyasu had started life as a prisoner, a pawn, and a nobody. But through patience, strategy, and timing, he became the man who unified Japan and ended centuries of civil war. Unlike many other leaders we've seen, he didn't rise with fury or drama. He rose with discipline, planning, and calm power.